Oh, I will start again. Just a moment, please. Good evening, everyone. We will begin the special session of the 2021 meeting of the Brazilian Keynesian Association with Professor Stephen Marglin as our invited keynote speaker. Professor Marglin holds the Walter S. Barker Chair in the Department of Economics at Harvard University, and over his distinguished career, he has contributed to many branches of economics. His published papers and books range over the foundation of cost-benefit analysis, the workings of the labor surplus economy, the organization of production, and the relationship between growth of income and its distribution, and the process of macroeconomic adjustment. Today, he will talk about his last book, Raising Keynes, the 21st Century General Theory, published this year by the Harvard University Press. In this book, Professor Marglin aims to build an analytical framework based on the central view of capitalist economies contained in Keynes' general theory of employment, interest, and money, namely that, quoting Keynes, it is an outstanding characteristic of the economic system in which we live that whilst it is subject to severe fluctuations in respect of output and employment, it's not violently unstable. Indeed, it seems capable of remaining in a chronic condition of subnormal activity for a considerable period without any marked tendency either towards recovery or towards complete collapse. Moreover, the evidence indicates that full or even approximately full employment is of rare or short-lived occurrence. And Keynes complements the last passage by saying that, but we must not conclude that the mean position that determines the natural tendencies, namely by those tendencies which are likely to persist, failing measures expressly designed to correct them, is therefore established by laws of necessity. The unimpeded rule of the above conditions is a fact of observation concerning the world as it is or has been, but and not a necessary principle which cannot be changed. Based on this vision, Professor Marglin provides a reconstruction of the Keynesian theory of capitalist economies, founded in an explicitly dynamic framework of analysis. Professor Marglin, we look forward to hearing your ideas on this important subject in this section. The section will be organized as follows. First, Professor Marglin will give a presentation of approximately 50 minutes. Afterwards, Professor Joaquim Andrade will have 10 to 15 minutes to present his comments, and then we will open space for the participation of the audience. Professor Marglin, thank you for accepting the invitation from the Brazilian Keynesian Association. It's an honor to have you as a speaker at our meeting. The floor is yours.
Fabio and Fabio, thank you both. Fabio, thank you for that very generous introduction and for laying out so clearly the scope of my talk today and what I hope to, the message I hope to leave with you. I'm going to try to share the screen because I have some slides. This is the last time I tried this, as some of you might know, it didn't work very well, but let's see if today it goes a little better. So I'm going to share this. Let's see. Let's see if that works. There we are. Okay. So here is the book cover. As we were talking about earlier, I'm sure we were trying to keep this secret. This is a large book. I can't hope to do anything more today than to acquaint you with its contents and hope to excite or incite you to read it. And I hope that this is the beginning of a dialogue. I'm prepared and indeed eager to enter into dialogue with all of you, and particularly those of you who disagree. I think that's what pushes our field forward. And I certainly do my share of disagreeing, and I hope that others will agree with me, disagree with me, and that this will, as I say, incite a deep dialogue about capitalism, about Keynes, and about a macroeconomic theory for the 21st century. So first question is, I've lost the, there we are. I've lost this view of at least some of you, but now I have it back. So what is the book about? Who is it for? And basically I have two audiences in mind. I've written this for teachers and students of mainstream economics with whom I hope to engage all of you in dialogue. And what I make bold to claim is that you will learn from this book, if you have studied the Orthodox canon, or if you teach the Orthodox canon, that everything that you have learned or taught about the determination of employment and output is at best half right. Contrary to what you've learned, flexible wages are not sufficient to restore full employment after a shock to the system. Interest rates are not determined by saving and investment, but rather in markets for financial assets, that is to say, by stocks of assets rather than flows. Demand management is necessary over the long run as well as the short run, since there's a trade-off between output and price stability in both the long run and the short run. And finally, the cutting edge of theory is policy. And what I think is particularly relevant for the third decade of the 21st century, certainly in the United States, but I think much more broadly, is to understand that fiscal policy is a tool that is necessary not only to avoid unemployment, but also for achieving the right mix of output. That budget deficits may be appropriate in the long run, not just under conditions of deficient demand, but even when the economy is running hot. So these are, in a sense, old ideas, but they're new ideas. And I think once again, Keynes was spot on, as the Brits would say, when he wrote that the difficulty lies not in the new ideas, but in escaping from the old ones, which ramify for those brought up, as most of us have been, into every corner of our minds. So that's one audience. Excuse me. Second audience is for, I think, perhaps more of the people in this group, students and teachers of heterodox macro. And what I offer you is a new appreciation and understanding of alternatives to mainstream macro. The first reviewer of Raising Keynes wrote, among other things, I had no idea what Joan Robinson was talking about when he was a student in Cambridge in the last years of Joan Robinson's life. I had no idea what she was talking about, but she certainly did. And now, so do I. Now, meaning now that the reviewer had read my book. So everybody will learn a new approach to macro that is not I'm not trying to channel Keynes. That's would be a nice idea if you could do it, but not a possible task, at least not for me. But an approach to macro that builds on Keynes's insights in the general theory, while at the same time answering the critics and the critiques that have grown up over the last 80 plus years. I spoke to the summer school that your association runs in conjunction with the meeting that is taking place now. And I got many interesting questions, as I'm hoping to get at the end of this talk, but one that really made me think is why the focus so much on orthodox economists? Why am I trying to convince orthodoxy rather than recognizing, as I think, or yeah, I suppose that's the right word, and for many of you, recognizing the futility of that enterprise? And the answer is this. There's really two parts, at least, to this answer. The first is that I think we are, and have been for some time, and we should be, in a battle for the hearts and minds of the economics profession. We shouldn't just be insular and speaking with each other. We have to convince the larger body of the profession. I don't think there's much of a chance for doing that for people my age and maybe even half my age. I do think there's a chance with the younger generation, with students who are beginning either their undergraduate or their graduate careers, who are much more open-minded than the mainstream of the profession. But they are under, as Keynes said, they are being formed in a particular way, and it's not enough to simply assert that they are in error. I think we have to demonstrate, and we have to demonstrate in a framework that makes sense to the mainstream of the economics profession. That's one part of the argument. The second part of the argument is that, as you will see, partly you'll see that today, but you'll see it even more as you, as I hope you do, delve into raising Keynes, that I make use of what are regarded as neoclassical tools. I don't think the tools are the problem. I think the use of the tools is the problem, and not the tools themselves. For example, and you will see this later, I make use of the so-called neoclassical production function. I make use of the concept of marginal productivity of labor, and even the marginal productivity of capital. I don't have any problem, as by the way, neither did Keynes, but that in a sense is irrelevant, with the concept of marginal productivity. I recognize that aggregation simplifies, and it's not only heterodox economists who recognize this. Not only simplifies, but distorts. But mainstream economists who studied issues of aggregation understand this as well, but the tools are nevertheless useful. The problem with marginal productivity is not the concept itself, but the idea that wages are determined by marginal productivity, the marginal productivity of labor. But that comes out of another assumption, and this is the assumption that I am attacking in raising Keynes. This is the assumption that Keynes was attacking in the general theory, and this is the assumption I want to spotlight today, namely that the natural tendency of a capitalist economy, at least a competitive capitalist economy, one without frictions and rigidities, that the natural tendency of such an economy is to full employment. It's that assumption which, along with the assumption of the marginal productivity of labor, makes for the argument that it is the marginal productivity of labor at full employment that determines the wage rate. The idea that marginal productivity of labor is equal to the wage rate, as we will see, is simply the assumption of profit maximization and, of course, perfect competition, price-taking agents, and so forth. But it's not an assumption that, it's a very different assumption to say that the marginal productivity of labor is equal to the wage at equilibrium, from saying that the marginal productivity of labor determines the wage. Those are two very different assumptions. I embrace the first and reject the second because I reject the idea, following Keynes and trying to flesh out his vision, that there is a natural tendency of the economy to full employment. So for these reasons, I believe that it is, and I'll come back to this at the very end, that it is an essential task of the younger generation of heterodox economists to engage with their orthodox counterparts and to, as Keynes said, attack them in their citadel, attack them in their, not on the assumption that there are rigidities and imperfections and that the competitive model does not hold for that reason, but to attack them on the basis of the competitive model itself. One thing that my book does not do, and I will make virtually no allusion to it today. I have one or two slides I want to show you, but more or less in passing, is the biography of Keynes the man. Keynes was one of the most fascinating personalities of the 20th century, and not just among economists, but as those of you who have studied his life, I think will agree. I can recommend two, and there's probably 50 more that could be recommended, biographies of Keynes. The standard one is the one on the right, Robert Skidelsky's classic biography. And by the way, the one-volume, 1,000-page edition is a condensation of 3 volumes that are each about 1,000 pages. And I, in reading them, never felt that they were too long. So that's a kind of classic, and I would, as I say, strongly recommend that to people who want to flesh out their understanding of Keynes economics by understanding Keynes, the man. The second, more recent biography, The Price of Peace by the journalist Zachary Carter, is really about Keynes, particularly as a public intellectual and his legacy as a public intellectual. And it's a much, it's shorter, I think, by half than Skidelsky's, and much more fluid read. I would say that The Price of Peace is clearly bedtime reading, and Skidelsky's, maybe you fall asleep over it. I would not suggest taking my book to bed, because if you drop it, you might hurt yourself. So read it when you are sitting up and not likely to nap. The one thing I do want to say, and again, I would urge this on people who are interested in Keynes, is a pilgrimage to an apartment that he owned rented and then I think owned from 1916 till his death in 1946, a townhouse actually, not an apartment, in the Bloomsbury region of London. And from the location of this extended family household that included writers, artists, other public intellectuals, Virginia Woolf, perhaps the most famous, A Room of Her Own. And I made the pilgrimage several years ago, and I have the evidence. Here is the house, 46 Gordon Square, and here more closely is the plaque, and there I am, and that's the evidence that I visited the shrine. So the question, first question that I want to address with you, I want to discuss with you, is why indeed 85 years after the publication of the general theory, why do we need one more exposition of its contents? And I think the answer to that requires an examination of the rise, fall, and what I hope is the resurrection of Keynes's vision, at least in the general theory. So the rise of Keynes was spectacular. Now, Keynes was not an unknown figure when the general theory was published. He was already an important public intellectual, but he was not the dominant figure by any means that he became, at least for many of us, in 20th century economics. He was one more voice, and others were shared his general ideas, and certainly his ideas about the importance or his ideas about policy. But as Paul Samuelson wrote in his obituary 10 years after the publication of the general theory published in 1936, as most of you know, and Keynes died, as you know, in 1946, short 10 years after publication. And so one of the reasons we need we've needed constant re-examination is that Keynes himself never had a chance to build on his own theory, never had a chance to seriously reply to the critics, because first of all, after for 2 or 3 years after the publication of the general theory, he was quite ill. Then World War II broke out and he was engaged in policy formulation for the British Treasury. And he lived only a few months after the end of the war and never had a chance to really think through and reformulate his ideas in the light of criticisms that have been raised and arguments that have been made against the general theory. As Samuelson said, it hit the profession. He didn't use the word pandemic, but given our experience over the last 16 months, I think it's an appropriate word. But it was a pandemic to which everyone over 35 was somehow immune. So the younger generation was very taken with Keynes's message, but the older generation didn't pretend, that's not right. The older generation was not so taken with the message and could rightly say that the message was not very clearly delivered. Keynes's policy innovation, and Keynes was first and foremost interested in theoretical work for the light it shed on economic policy. And Keynes's message, his fundamental policy message, was that monetary policy, that first of all, that the economy left to its own devices, capitalist economy that was supposed from Adam Smith's day on to be self-regulating, would not, left to its own devices, produce full employment. Fabio, in his introduction, had a very eloquent statement of this from Keynes's own pen, and that in order to achieve an efficient allocation of resources, in order to achieve full employment, monetary policy might be insufficient. Monetary policy is already an intervention in the economy. It's not the economy left to its own devices, but that it might not be enough. And that under circumstances that were present in the Great Depression and Keynes foresaw what might be endemic to the system, that fiscal policy, the use of the government purse, spending, taxes, and in Keynes's own words, the socialization of investment. He's very vague as to what that meant, but something more surely than simply manipulating budgets and instituting public works in times of recession. That would be that should be the normal recourse of government in order to manage the economy. A very famous quote from the general theory about the importance of or the role of deficit spending in achieving full employment. And basically, Keynes argued that, as this quote says, that if the government were to even engage in wasteful expenditure, that would be better than doing nothing, that these expenditures would be an indirect contribution to business recovery, and that it would, in effect, prime the pump. Now, I anticipate that there are some people in the audience who are saying, this doesn't sound quite right to me. It's not how I remember the quote from Keynes. And you are 100% correct. This is not a quote from Keynes. This is a quote from Jacob Viner, writing in 1933. And I want you to note that, that date, because it's 3 years prior to the publication of the general theory. But he's saying the same thing as Keynes was saying in the actual quote from the general theory. If the Treasury were to fill old bottles with banknotes and bury them, etc., wasteful expenditure, and leave it to private enterprise to dig the notes up, there need be no more unemployment. He's saying the same thing as Viner. Now, Viner, let me say, was, like Keynes, a distinguished economist, and students of the history of thought will know the name of Jacob Viner. Most of the economics profession never heard of Viner, just like the profession has never heard of a lot of important contributors to our understanding. And the reason is very simple. The reason is that while Viner had the right intuition about the need for government intervention, he did not have a framework in which this made sense. And the appeal of Keynes in this pandemic to the under 35 generation, who had learned from their teachers that there was no good reason for the government to intervene because any shocks to the economy that produced unemployment would first of all be short-lived. The economy was self-regulating and self-correcting. And certainly in the long run, there was nothing the government could do to make things better. Government intervention would only make things worse. That's what they had learned from their teachers. But when they looked outside from their studies or from their classroom, they could see men and women literally begging for jobs. They could see the unemployment in the streets. How did they square their lived experience with what they had learned? Well, Viner didn't help them in that. Keynes did. Keynes provided a theoretical framework in which the policy message made sense. In fact, there's relatively little about fiscal policy in the general theory. I think it appears I think the term appears in the index, but most of the references have very little to do with his central message. The one that you're looking at on the screen now, of course, does have a lot to do with the central message. But as I said, his central message actually in its positive sense was pretty vague. He called for a socialization of investment and left it pretty much up for grabs as to what that would mean. But the lesson of this is that for Keynes to accomplish his policy message, his policy revolution, actually, he needed a threefold book. He needed a book which laid out the policy, which he, as I said, he didn't do very comprehensively. He needed the theory that in which the theoretical framework in which the policy made sense, and he needed a new methodology to make that theory work. And as I've already suggested, he needed a theory which was not simply a theory that said that there are frictions and rigidities, there is monopoly, there is oligopoly. The perfectly competitive model doesn't really work all that well as a description of the real world of the 1920s or the 1930s or the 2020s. That wasn't sufficient for several reasons. For one, it had already been done. People understood that there was monopoly and oligopoly, and they understood that, in fact, you could say Adam Smith's classic Wealth of Nations was about getting rid of some rigidities and frictions that prevented the economy from working well. And the lesson that people took was that, yes, let's remove all the rigidities, let's remove all the frictions, but that's the best thing that can be done for the economy. Active intervention in the form of fiscal policy, socialization of investment, even monetary policy, that was unnecessary in the framework of a perfectly competitive economy, one without rigidities, one without imperfection. And that was the economy that made sense in the longer period, even if there were short-term rigidities, short-term frictions, short-term imperfections. In Keynes's own terms, he has this very useful phrase. He says, what we have to do is attack them in their citadel. We have to attack them in the citadel, them being orthodoxy of his day, and we could say the same about the orthodoxy of our day. We have to attack them on the basis of not of imperfections and frictions, which will be argued are first of all, short-term in nature, and secondly, there will be among the economics profession virtual unanimous agreement that yes, let's remove all the frictions and rigidities, and then we'll be in the paradise of the economic textbook. We'll be in the paradise of a self-regulating, efficient economy in which indeed there is a job for every willing worker. And Keynes said that's the notion that we have to attack. And that was so the rise of Keynes, I would summarize by saying the way that Keynes took the younger generation by storm was this attack on the citadel, that he provided a framework in which interventionist policies made sense, And the fall consisted of attacks from three fronts. And I'm going to pay special attention today, and I pay special attention in the book, to the third, economics. And I'm going to just mention briefly politics and the economy as distinct from the economics of the post-war period up to today. So what are the politics? Well, the politics, the immediate post-war period, when the under 35 generation that was so taken with Keynes in the 1930s had now risen to positions of prominence and indeed even power in the economics profession. It was a period in the United States in particular, but not only in the United States, of political persecution of the left, and the any association not only with communism, which was Soviet communism, which was perceived as an existential threat to the United States and the so-called free world, but any form of socialism was tainted by this political repression known in general under the term of McCarthyism, but McCarthy was not a lone wolf and a sole operator. It's debatable the extent to which one could say with a straight face that Keynes was somehow a socialist, but it was said, and it was said successfully. And indeed, friends of Keynes have made the argument, and most recently, I think a book I would recommend if you want to read the argument as to why Keynes was indeed a socialist, is a book by colleague James Crotty, titled Keynes Against Capitalism, His Economic Case for Liberal Socialism. I don't agree with this at all. I think Keynes was from first to last, a defender of capitalism, and not the rugged, individualistic, every man for himself and devil take the hindmost, not that kind of capitalism, but for an enlightened capitalism and a softer kind of capitalism. But make no mistake, at least in my judgment, Keynes was a defender of capitalism, and the idea that even though he did, at least on one occasion, describe himself as a liberal socialist, as Crotty says, I think this was I think this had very little to do with what socialism meant in the 1930s or 1940s or 1950s. Perhaps a little more to do with what socialism means in the United States when talking about such people as Bernie Sanders or AOC or other people who call themselves socialists, but their ideas about socialism are much closer to what was called in the aftermath of World War II, called social democracy, indeed to distinguish it from socialism. In any case, whatever Keynes was, in fact, he was painted as a socialist, or as at least giving aid and comfort to the socialists, softening up the so-called free world for the attack by international communism under the banner of liberal socialism. And this made it harder to defend Keynes and made it easier to attack Keynes's economics, even however unfounded those attacks might be. So there was certainly a political element in the fall of Keynes. And as I say, this is not the emphasis in raising Keynes, but it would be disingenuous not to acknowledge it. There was as well the economy. And what do I mean by the economy? I mean, in particular, the stagflation of the 1970s. And the stagflation of the 1970s brought into sharp focus the importance of the supply side in the economy. This would not have surprised Keynes. Keynes never ignored the supply side. He never said it's all about demand. His argument was that demand is a factor which cannot be ignored. It is a central factor, but for Keynes, I would echo this argument, for Keynes it's demand and supply, not demand in place of supply. Many of Keynes's disciples lost sight of the supply side, and the stagflation of the economy, which was a supply side phenomenon, rising prices with unemployment, took people off guard and again weakened Keynesian economics, though it shouldn't have weakened Keynes's economics. The third element, and this is the one I focus on in Raising Keynes, and I want to focus on today, is the economics of Keynes and what it became in the hands of Keynesians, particularly American Keynesians in the mainstream. And this is old Keynesians and new Keynesians. So Keynes, as I said, believed that it was important and indeed necessary to attack mainstream economics, not in terms of rigidities and frictions, not in terms of monopolies, not in terms of trade union power, but rather in terms of the competitive model. And one aspect of the competitive model, as we know, is that wages are flexible and respond to unemployment. So if unemployment rises, we would expect wages to fall. Keynes frames his argument, the first 18 chapters of the general theory, in terms of rigid money wages. Why does he do this if he's attacking them in their citadel? Well, he does it because he's trying to explain a very complicated theory. Complicated, as he says, because people have to shed their old ideas in order to grasp the new ones. So he's presenting something totally new, and he does this in a simplified form. And the assumption of fixed wages, which he makes for 18 chapters, he intends as scaffolding. So when you build a building, you have all the scaffolding around it to help with the construction of the building. When the building is done, you take the scaffolding down. And that's indeed what Keynes does. And in chapter 19, as most of you know, chapter 19 of the general theory has the title Changes in Money Wages, and he addresses the issue of what happens when money wages change. And he argues that it doesn't really affect his argument. If anything, it strengthens his argument. Chapter 19 was not a great success as far as the economics profession was concerned. And partly, largely I would say, because Keynes could not provide the kind of framework that he provides in the first 18 chapters for his argument of chapter 19. What he has instead is a series of stories. And they're good stories. They're all relevant stories, they're important stories, but they're not a model in any sense, and they don't provide a framework in the same way that the first 18 chapters do. You can't criticize Keynes for this, because the tools that he would have needed in order to construct the framework were simply not available to economists in the 1930s. So his vision ran ahead of the tools he had in order to argue effectively for his vision. The economics profession, even those friendly to him, transformed his argument of chapter 19 that says that flexible wages don't matter into an argument that says that, yes, they do matter. And when wages are flexible, the argument, the natural tendency of the economy to produce full employment, to produce an efficient allocation of resources will assert itself, and the economy, after a shock, will gravitate back to full employment. So there are variants of this argument. One is Franco Modigliani, who is always considered by himself, I can attest to that, and by others as a Keynesian, and won a Nobel Prize for his contributions to Keynesian ideas. He produced one version of this. More critical, more unfriendly readers of the general theory produced another argument, so-called real balance effect, but both of these arguments hinged on the flexibility of wages. The outcome of this, and this is all this argument, Keynes's argument, his critics' argument, are assessed in the first 4 chapters of my book. And I conclude, as the economics profession concluded by the 1970s, that Keynes was wrong, that Keynes had lost the argument. That yes, if there were rigidities and frictions, then the economy might never get to full employment once there was a shock that drove it away from full employment. But if there were no rigidities and no frictions, the economy would indeed gravitate to full employment, and that all that Keynes had really done was to provide a more sophisticated version of what I call sand in the wheels, of how an economy operates under frictions, rigidities, etc. I conclude that the critics won the argument, but they won it on their turf. And that was the wrong turf for this argument. That was the wrong playing field in which to test these ideas. What do I mean by that? The argument was carried out in the framework of comparative statics. So the argument that wage changes don't matter was carried out by imagining a universe of several planets, maybe millions of planets, on which the wage rate is different. So if you travel from planet to planet, you indeed observe changes in the wage rate. But in time, there is no change in the wage rate, because on each of these planets, the wage is today what it was yesterday, and tomorrow it will be what it is today. So in the common sense meaning of change and Keynes's meaning of change, which is change in real time, the comparative statics model fails because it doesn't capture that at all. What it captures is going from one place where the wage is at one level to another place where the wage is at another level, and observing the differences between those planets. Why does that matter? Before I get to that, sorry, I'll get to that in a moment. Let me give you the kind of classical statement of the conclusion of the economics profession by 1970, and that is a statement by Milton Friedman, which I'm quoting here in the slide that's before you. And he says, in effect, that, not in effect, he says it quite literally, that we don't have to spend any time on Keynes's fundamental, what he calls the attack on the citadel, because it's been proven to be wrong. Been proven to be wrong in the works of Franco Modigliani. It's been proven to be wrong in the works of Habeler, Pigou, and others who worked on the real balance effect. So Friedman says all sorts of frictions and rigidities may be there, But in the long run, there's at least a hypothetical competitive equilibrium economy which will be attained by a capitalist system left to its own devices. There is no fundamental flaw, as Keynes claimed, there is no fundamental flaw in the price system, according to Milton Friedman. This, of course, was the conclusion not only of Milton Friedman, who was no friend of Keynes and no friend of the policies that Keynes' theory led to, but it was also the conclusion of mainstream Keynesianism. So the old Keynesians, Samuelson, Tobin, etc., the young generation of the 1930s, who by the 1960s, 70s, etc., were the senior statesmen of economics. It's also, of course, the legacy that's been handed down and is firmly in the hands of the so-called new Keynesians, the dominant form of macroeconomics, so much so that I had a conversation several years ago when I was in the middle of this project with a prominent new Keynesian economist, and we had lunch together, and I was telling him about my project. And his first question was, he said, well, what's your rigidity? What's your particular friction? Because new Keynesian economics is, it's not one friction, it's another. And the whole field consists of finding new frictions, basically, to elaborate upon. So in this respect, there is no disagreement between the old Keynesians and the new Keynesians, and indeed the critics from the right, the new classical economists, rational expectations and all that. The difference of opinion lies only about the short run and only about the effects of frictions and rigidities in the short run. But about the long run, everybody's agreed. The economy will function like a perfectly close enough to the way a perfectly competitive economy will function. Therefore, no constructive role for the government and for government intervention. Why, you may ask, doesn't the comparative statics model work? What's the problem with that model that it doesn't capture the effects of real-time changes? The case of farmers, and I focus on US farmers, is an extreme case, and it requires a separate modeling, which I provide in chapter 8 of my book. But in this respect, it's illustrative. In 1931, the depths of the Depression, the price of wheat in the United States was a third of what it was in the 1920s. Similarly, the price of cotton was a third of what it was in the 1920s. In the 1920s, farmers had taken out large mortgages on their property, undertaken large debts to finance mechanization, to buy land, for all kinds of purposes. But when the Depression hit, they had to pay back those loans with 3 times as much production as when they borrowed the money in the first place. This is the effect of changes in prices and wages in real time. This isn't move. If you move from one planet to another, you don't have this kind of problem because the price never changes. So if you took out debts at $1.20 on planet A, then you're going to repay those debts with wheat at $1.20 5 years later. And if you took out debts on planet B with wheat at 60 cents a bushel, you're going to repay those debts with wheat at 60 cents a bushel. That's not the way things work in real time. In real time, you take out debts at one level, and if prices change, you pay them back at another level. So for farmers, the case was very dramatic, but for the whole economy, the same problem existed because prices and wages fell throughout the economy. So the comparative statics exercise, which is perfectly useful for many purposes, and I use it myself, and make no apologies for using it. But in order to understand the problem that Keynes was addressing in the general theory, and what I would regard as a fundamental problem of macroeconomics, comparative statics won't do. And this is why I said Keynes lacked the method, because he didn't, while he was clear that comparative statics wouldn't work, he didn't have the alternative of a dynamic framework. So what I regard as a basic contribution of raising Keynes is to develop that framework and apply it to the problem of the determination of employment and output, the problem of the general theory. So we come now to the what my book is really about, and that is trying to make a contribution to the resurrection of Keynes, but the resurrection of Keynes in a dynamic framework, in an explicitly dynamic framework. So let me back up again a little bit and look at what you learn and what perhaps some of you have taught in microeconomics. And if you look at virtually any standard text of introductory economics, you will find a diagram like the one that's in this slide. There's two schedules, two curves. One is a demand for labor. And that demand for labor is based on profit maximization. And as you see in equilibrium, indeed, I'm sorry, not in equilibrium, not just in equilibrium, but anywhere on this, let me get the laser pointer functioning. Anywhere on this demand schedule, the wage is equal to the marginal productivity of labor. That's the condition of profit maximization in a competitive economy. Doesn't mean that the marginal productivity of labor determines wages, just means that to maximize profits, the marginal productivity of labor has to be equal to the wage, whatever the real wage, whatever it is. And it's only at full employment, which means as well being on the supply curve of labor, that is the amount of labor that people want to offer at any going wage. That's the definition of full employment. So the equilibrium in this economy is one at which there is both profit maximization, that's the condition of being in a capitalist economy and optimizing in a capitalist economy, and being on the supply curve of labor, that is the amount of labor that workers want to offer at the going wage, and the equilibrium is where both those conditions are satisfied. So we have the real wage on one axis and employment on the other axis. I transform this because, and this is simply an expositional device. I could work in this space, but it's easier for reasons that I don't have to get into, to simply invert the real wage, and instead of working with W over P, we work with P over W, the real price. And the demand for labor then becomes a supply of goods schedule, where the marginal cost of production is equal to the real marginal cost of production, which is the inverse of the marginal productivity of labor, is equal to the real price. Okay. So that defines the supply of goods schedule, and that, of course, is exactly the same condition as defines the demand for labor that I previously exhibited in the last slide. Supply of labor is the same thing. It's how much people want to work at any going wage, but it's now transformed from employment into output. So it's the amount on this axis, instead of employment, we have output, and it's the amount of output that is produced as far as the supply curve is, supply of labor is concerned, is the amount of goods that would be produced by workers who are optimizing their employment, optimizing the amount of time they want to work at the going wage, and optimizing profits, that is, optimizing the amount of production that capitalists want to make at the going wage for labor. So this is the pre-Keynesian orthodoxy, and this is the orthodoxy today as exhibited, at least for the long run, in virtually every standard elementary text that I have looked at. I shouldn't say every text because I've looked at them all, but I've certainly looked at the leaders, Mankiw's text, Blinder and Baumol, which is now Blinder, Baumol, and Solo, Paul Krugman's text, Robin Wells, etc. So that's orthodoxy. What does Keynes add to the picture? Keynes adds, as I've already said, the notion that demand, not the demand as in terms of profit maximization, but the primary demand that comes from the consumption and investment, effective demand, or what I call aggregate demand, is an additional element of the picture. And in the simplest case, it is simply a vertical line determined by real elements. It's determined by where real consumption plus investment is equal to real output. That's measured on this axis. Or same thing, where desired savings is equal to desired investment. These two are equivalent. And in the simplest case, and this is a very, very simple case, which again, is for expositional purposes, and I develop more complicated cases in the general, in raising Keynes. But in the simplest case, it's simply a vertical line with aggregate demand being independent of the real price of goods, independent of the real wage. But you can see now that the problem that Keynes has in a static model, which is that the model is overdetermined. There are three schedules and two variables. So what Keynes does for expositional purposes to show how his model is working is to, for 18 chapters, basically suppress the supply of labor schedule. That gives him two schedules, and he can then develop his arguments in this static framework. I don't do that. I say there is a labor supply function operating, there is profit maximization operating, and there is aggregate demand operating. So how do we resolve the indeterminacy or the overdeterminacy of this model? And my argument is that it depends precisely on the adjustment process that you specify. What happens, how does output change? How does employment change? How do prices change? How do wages change? How do the price of goods changes when you're not in equilibrium? And that dynamic formulation will determine the equilibrium itself. And for different specifications of adjustment processes, we could have different places within this green sub area of the total diagram. So we're really reversing the normal process by which we economists, and I've done this too in the past, I won't do it anymore, but I've done it in the past, where we start with a static model and then we add some dynamics just to show that our equilibrium is stable. What I'm saying is that you've got it backwards. We have to start with the process, and the process of adjustment will determine the equilibrium. Could be here, could be here, could be depending on the adjustment process, anywhere. And it may not be a stable equilibrium. There may be no equilibrium, but you don't know that unless you specify the process first. So, whoops. Oh, no, go back. I'm sorry. It's this way. So here's one possible equilibrium, and I give an adjustment process which would get you to this equilibrium. And how is that an equilibrium? Well, it's an equilibrium because you're on the aggregate demand schedule, and in this process I haven't laid out, but in the process that lies behind this particular equilibrium, output is stationary because the demand for consumption goods plus investment goods is just equal to output. That is to say, desired saving is just equal to investment. And because there's unemployment in this model, here's the level of output, here's full employment. So there's unemployment in the model, and therefore wages are falling. Standard argument. But there are profit opportunities because the price, the real price at E exceeds the real marginal cost given by the supply of goods schedule. Therefore, producers who are looking for an optimum want to raise output, want to raise sales, and the way they do that is by reducing prices. And we're at an equilibrium if the pressure on prices is exactly balanced by the pressure on wages, in which case the ratio of prices to wages remains unchanged. That is to say, the real price, the real wage remains stationary. So it's an equilibrium, but it's not an equilibrium in the way you learn in the standard text. It's not an equilibrium of supply and demand. It's an equilibrium of a balance of forces which are pushing one way or another, and they are just in balance, and therefore there is no movement in the economy. This, I would argue, is a good description of what happened in the Great Depression. Prices and wages were falling, and they fell, as a matter of fact, at about the same rate in the United States from 1929 to 1933. The recovery began in 1933, not because of any self-regulating force within the economy, but because the Roosevelt regime changed the rules of the game, and through various forms of intervention, moved the aggregate demand schedule in the direction of full employment. It was a long and torturous recovery and didn't really succeed until World War II brought demand well above the capacity of the economy for supplying goods and services. But the direction was, first of all, the right direction. And secondly, there was nothing self-regulating about it. It wasn't something generated by the economy itself. It was generated by the interventionist policies of the Roosevelt government. That's the main message of the first part of Raising Keynes. And I'm going to speak briefly about the other parts because I can see we are already well over time, and even with a delay, I can claim some time back from the delay, but not too much. But I just want to say a few words about the rest of the book and what I regard as its contributions. So chapters 9 to 13 are what I call building blocks. And There are chapters on consumption and saving, on investment, and on interest. And there are long and involved arguments, which clearly we don't have time to go into, but I will say something about the takeaways from this. The takeaway from the argument about consumption and saving is that it's a fool's errand to look for one universal theory of consumption or theory of saving. It's rather what I call different strokes for different folks. There are different, we live in a class economy, and there are different theories of consumption and saving which apply to different classes. Roughly speaking, it's very rough, I would say 3/4 of the population are well described by a very simple Keynesian model where consumption is a fraction of income. There's another almost 1/4 of the population, the remaining 1/4 of the population, which is reasonably well described by the innovations of both the critics and the friends of Keynes that took the form in Friedman's formulation, the permanent income hypothesis, in Franco Modigliani's formulation, the life cycle hypothesis, both of them based on the key assumption that it was wealth rather than income which drives consumption. And that's, I think, for a fraction of the population, that's not a bad assumption. But, and we can get into this more in the question period if people want to delve into this, but I'll leave it at that. Now, the final remark, that there's the 1%, or maybe it's the 1/10 of 1%, I'm not sure, the very rich. We basically know nothing about what determines their consumption and their saving. Well, you might say, well, what difference does it make? They're just a small fraction of the population. Of course, they're the fraction with most of the money, most of the income, most of the wealth, so it matters a lot. But we know very, very little about their consumption and saving behavior. The takeaway of the takeaway is that this all provides, for me anyway, a good argument for using a class-based approach to saving and consumption rather than trying to find a model in which one size fits all. And here I would build on the pioneering work of Koletsky, Kaldor, Joan Robinson, Luigi Pazzanetti, and others, mostly, virtually all heterodox economists. Investment. Here the main takeaway and the main argument that I want to add to what I believe is already out there is the importance of the distinction between capital widening and capital deepening. Capital widening being investment to expand production, and capital deepening being investment to substitute capital for labor, substitute machinery for labor. Why is that important? Well, first of all, the literature has mostly, virtually, I don't know, 99%, mostly, concentrated on capital, the growth literature, I mean, growth models, concentrated on capital widening, with, of course, some very important discussion of technological change, but this is not technological progress. Capital widening is making use of already known technologies, but simply substituting more machinery, more capital for labor. Why does that matter? Why is that distinction important? And the reason is that the two kinds of investment respond very differently to the real price of labor, to the real wage. Therefore, profit-led and wage-led growth, that distinction and that whole argument about which model is applicable has an important cyclical dimension to it, because the proportions of capital widening and capital deepening vary significantly over the cycle. And the argument for wage-led growth is much stronger in a period of slack demand because of the greater importance of capital deepening. Again, we can come back to this. I hope it's well explained in my book, but that's all I have time to say about it now. Finally, in this section on building blocks, the theory of interest. And this was, of course, in terms of the building blocks themselves, as distinct from the framework as a whole, was Keynes's principal innovation. And he argued persuasively to me, but not to the mainstream of the profession, that the action for interest rate determination is not saving an investment. And that, again, is what you will find in virtually every orthodox text. Not saving an investment, but it's an asset markets for the financial equivalent of the stock of capital goods rather than the flow. On this fundamental point, I think Keynes was exactly right, and that the error of the mainstream is a principal reason for its fundamental misunderstanding of Keynes and Keynes's contribution. Where Keynes went wrong, and again, I can only give you the takeaway. Where Keynes went wrong is to confuse his theory, liquidity preference theory, to misunderstand his own theory as a theory of the level of the interest rate. It is rather a theory of interest rate differences, of the spreads between various interest rates. Is that a difference with, or is that a distinction that really matters, or is it a distinction that doesn't make any difference? Well, I would argue that it's a difference that really matters, given Keynes's fundamental, and I think the right fundamental theoretical objective of arguing that a capitalist system left to its own devices would not produce full employment. Because the way that the circle is closed, as it were, the way that a theory of spreads is transformed into a theory of levels of interest rate, is to argue that the central bank actually determines the base rate, as it will, the policy rate, and therefore it's left to markets to determine the spreads. So the central bank provides what markets cannot provide on their own, which is an anchoring of the spread, basically. So in a world without central banks, in a world in which capitalism is literally left to its own devices, that, of course, in the modern world is a hypothetical case, but in that case, the equilibrium is actually indeterminate. So it's even more chaotic, and I would argue that Keynes was wrong in the very good capsule that Fabio gave in his introduction. Again, I hope I'm tempting you. I have to leave it to you to read the argument. The last part of the book is about Keynes in the long run. And that, of course, from the mainstream is an oxymoron, because Keynes doesn't apply to the long run. Keynes is a theorist at best of the short run. The attempt to extend Keynes to the long run started before the ink was dry on the pages of the general theory. Roy Harrod was the pioneer. The American N.Z. Domar was another somewhat later pioneer. And their argument was that even if there was a short-term serendipitous equality between demand and supply so that full employment were achieved, there was nothing to guarantee that that equilibrium would reproduce itself over time. And instead, they argued that there was the possibility, indeed the likelihood, of growing unemployment on the one hand, or a hyperinflationary situation where demand was pressing much too tightly on resources, and the result was an endemic inflation, maybe not hyperinflation, but inflation. Well, the history of this is fairly, I think now very clear, that Bob Solow intervened in the 1950s with a classic article, but it was an article in which Solow really destroys a straw man. And he doesn't address the problem that Harrod and Domar are raising, and that is how aggregate demand is going to be balanced with supply side considerations in the long run. Solow simply assumes that problem away by assuming that the government or the heavens have intervened to ensure that there are no aggregate demand problems, and then goes on to solve a different problem of how the capital labor ratio evolves over time. Joan Robinson insisted all her life on the relevance of aggregate demand in the long run as well as in the short run. But I believe that her attempts were unsuccessful. And I think they were unsuccessful because of the empirical reality that we didn't have, on the one hand, growing unemployment, and we didn't have, on the other hand, endemic inflation. So whatever the theory might say, the empirics seem to bear out the argument that there was no fundamental long-run problem. My contribution in this is to argue that the whole labor supply equation has to be reinterpreted in the long run. In the short run, it's perfectly reasonable to take the labor force as given. It's whatever the population, the work age population might be. In the long run, it is not, as virtually all models have done, reasonable to take the labor force as a given exogenously, because as far as capitalism is concerned, it has recourse to other sectors, both within the economy and outside the domestic economy, to draw upon if the resources of the capitalist sector are insufficient. You know this very well in Brazil, of course, because you have a very large so-called informal sector, which is not capitalist. It may be profit maximization, but it's not capitalist, as I understand the term. And even in the advanced economies, we've had sectors on which to draw historically. In the US, in the 20th century, the first half of the 20th century, the capitalist sector drew on the agricultural sector, which was at that time not capitalist at all. It was family farms run on very different principles. In the second half of the 20th century, we drew more and more women into the paid labor force, not that they weren't working before, but in addition to their domestic work, they took on paid labor to an increasing degree. And from the beginning of our country, even before the formal beginning of our country and most Latin American countries, the immigration has always been a resource on which to draw when the resources of the capitalist sector required it. That changes the picture completely, and I argue that with that understanding of the labor force and labor force dynamics, that the labor force is essentially endogenous in the long run, that Keynes's arguments, his vision, make as much sense in the long run as in the short run. finally, and I'm sorry that I've gone over and I'm almost done. I think 3 more slides. I have a part of this book on fiscal policy, and not only on countercyclical fiscal policy, which is of course not limited now. That is the one surviving policy legacy of Keynes in the orthodox model, applied to the short run, of course. But I argue that it applies to the long run as well. And I argue that it applies in a way that Keynes never considered. And that is that even at full employment, once the government takes responsibility for maintaining full employment, it has, as Abba Lerner recognized, a responsibility for the mix of aggregate demand as well as for the level of aggregate demand. So how much consumption, how much investment, how much of those goods which are, if not necessarily, typically provided by government, infrastructure, education, etc. What is that mix? And what are the consequences for debt, for deficit and debt? And my argument is that even in an economy, as I said in the beginning, which runs hot, there could be an argument, there can be an argument for deficits that are permanent in nature in order to optimize not the level of aggregate demand, but the mix of aggregate demand. I close with this because I think it is quite topical in the United States and perhaps in the rest of the world as well. The term is used, not a term I particularly like, but it's a term that is currently used of, are we at an inflection point? Are we at an inflection point in terms of policy and in terms of economics? And I think the two go together. And what I mean by, what my understanding of that is, that economic policies and political practice rise and fall together. I think this was true in the heyday of Keynes, that Keynes's theory supported the New Deal in the US, social democracy in Europe and elsewhere, that the New Deal and social democracy also gave legitimacy to Keynes's attack of the citadel of mainstream economics, not only on the left, but on the right. I think the economics of rational expectations, of new classical economics, even of new Keynesian economics, have been supportive of Reagan, Thatcher kinds of policies in the US and Great Britain, anti-government, if you will, and that the sport went both ways. The economics supported the politics and the politics supported the economics. And the question of being at an inflection point is, are we at similarly a place where a new economics might support a new politics, and a new politics might be supportive of a new economics? And I'm more optimistic on this point. I don't have a crystal ball, but I'm more optimistic on this point than I was, say, even a year or 2 years ago. And I guess I would conclude by saying that I hope that Raising Keynes can be a contribution to building that alliance between a new politics and a new economics. Thank you for your indulgence, and I look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you, Professor Stephen. And I will open the floor for Professor Joaquim Andrade.
Can I get out of this screen sharing? I don't see a...
Oh, you have...
I don't seem to have...
At the top...
the top over here. Thank you very much. Stop share. There we go. Okay.
Joaquim, it's closed. Your micro is not open.
No.
Okay. Now it's okay.
Okay, then I want to say that if I would be more comfortable if I were not had not been your student, but I would say that is a masterpiece. Your book is almost no, it is a masterpiece. You are original in every point. You have so much new things and new interpretations. It's not just a new, it's not just a review of Keynes. It's really a radical view of Keynes. And so, and I'm afraid probably a lot of people will disagree with you about the monetary aspect. But it's, and I also saw that you spend about 100 pages on the issue, more than any other topic. Well, it's consistent with the importance of liquidity preference. On price flexibility, I think it's a wonderful topic, and the way you solve the question is fantastic. And also the method, for me and probably for many people, they could read John Robinson and could not understand what it was all about. And when you use it, the method, it becomes very clear and very interesting and important. As to the investment, I looked for animal spirits and I almost didn't find. But I didn't find because you are almost a step ahead, in the sense that you are quite close to the behavioral economics, I believe, on this issue. I know that you disagree a little bit, but anyway, on the long run, I see something that looks familiar with Piketty. I don't know if you agree. Piketty has something about the endogenous, but there I think it's more like there is a correlation between growing population, not the population that you bring from other sectors, but growing population and growing economy. The very, very close relationship on the long run. And it must have some relation to your way of thinking. Well, I think it's a marvelous book, and your effort on the liquidity preference is fantastic. And I hope another thing I want to say is that you have been very opportunistic, in a good sense, because in the after 2008. It looks like even the political, despite the political not changing, but the theory changed quite a lot. From 2008, I think marks a change. And I know, you know Fahir, from Harvard. He just died, and his paper was I saw his paper 1 week before he died, and his paper was on Minsky, and to give you I think the spirit of the time. And I would say also that you should be careful with Lucas. He looks very much he's becoming radical, I would say. But that's another story. So your point on monetary theory in Keynes is absolutely fantastic, and you have to be very strong to support the criticism, because probably people will Keynesians will criticize you, but I think the idea of your book is again is almost trying to transform the language in a language that can be written and understood by everybody, even from the neoclassical point of view. And I think this is something that you have in your behaviors since I know you, that you try to make this happen. So I think it's a marvelous piece, and it came in a special time that will probably will help a lot and succeed in the academic fields. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joaquin. If you want to comment, Professor Marglin, you may do it now, and then we will open for the questions. If you prefer, we can open for the questions right now.
Well, I've spoken at too great a length already, so I do want to thank my good friend Joaquin for a flattering assessment. I welcome flattery. It's a very nice feeling, but I'll save. I do have something substantive to say about points you made, but I think it would be better to save that for later and to get other people into the conversation.
Please.
So I open for the audience.
Well, I just have a little comment to make. Professor Steve, thank you very much for your lecture. It was great. There was a moment you said that in the general theory, Keynes said much more about monetary theory or monetary policy than fiscal policy. And there was a time I had this curiosity, because I have always thought that the general theory was a book on monetary policy when regarding public policy. And so I made a word count, and I discovered that the terms, the words monetary policy, monetary authority, and monetary management appeared 33 times in the general theory. And the word fiscal appeared only 8 times, 4 of them in the same paragraph.
Yeah.
And furthermore, we have budget deficit appearing only 2 times in the general theory as a whole. So as you said, this word counting just corroborates with what you said. Fiscal policy, if you are willing to see the Keynes prescriptions of fiscal policy, you won't find it on the general theory. Just this comment, because I think that it matches very well with what you have said earlier.
Juliano.
Professor, thank you very much for your brilliant presentation, lecture. I am anxious to read your book. My question is, what do you think the Keynes ideas in the context of the developing economies, considering Keynes ideas, what do you think the Keynes ideas in the context of the developing economies, considering specifically the small policy space of these economies? In general terms, how do you think Keynes policy innovation, in your terms, in the 21st century? How do you think the application of the Keynes ideas in a not Keynesian world? Thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, those are
Thank you.
I'm sorry,
Okay.
should I answer, or should we get more questions on the table, or should I answer, or should I comment
No,
on it?
it's your, you may answer now. You can,
Okay,
you may answer, okay.
well, I'll answer briefly so to make space for others, but you raised two very important points. And I think it's fair to say that Keynes was not terribly interested in the rest of the world. When Keynes spoke about mankind, for example, he was including women because mankind was a generic term, but he wasn't including people from Latin America or from Asia or from Africa. Mankind for Keynes meant Europeans and North Americans. Is this a fault? Of course, but it was a fault of his class and time, and it's just a fact. I think had Keynes also, and on the positive side, showed more ability to change his mind and change his views and to develop his views in the light of experience. I think there's no question that in the post-war environment, he would have got more interested in the specific problems of the rest of the world and could perhaps have been persuaded that mankind includes brown people and black people and people whose first language was not English, along with Brits and grudgingly Americans. What his views would have been, of course, hard to say. The relevance of his economics, I think, is clear. Aggregate demand matters in the developing world as well as in the rich countries. And Keynes never claimed, as I said, and I would insist on, that only demand matters. So he would have been quite aware of supply issues, of labor force issues, labor force mobilization, etc. But he would have emphasized, I think, in the context of the developing world, as well as in the context of the rich countries, that aggregate demand has an important role to play too. In the 21st century, and this is the principal aim of my book, this is not, there is some history of thought. It's a necessary part of the argument. There is some history of economics. That's a necessary part of the argument. History of the economy. But the aim of the book is not antiquarian. I don't claim to be an expert in the history of thought, and I'm not trying to present this work as a work in the history of thought. It's an attempt to take Keynes's vision and articulate it in a framework which is useful for the 21st century and for addressing the problems of the 21st century in both the rich and the poorer parts of the world.
Thank you. More questions? I have one.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I have one.
You're allowed.
I have some mixed feelings about the strategy of attacking the citadel, because what bothers me is that when you do this, in a certain sense, it's conceding to the enemy some assumptions or some ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And when we are interested in constructing, in building something that it's to analyze a capitalist economy nowadays, it may be a kind of limitation if you concede too much. I give an example: the inverse relationship between real wage and employment. Is it a good explanation? Is it observing facts, or there is this relationship, anti-cyclical real wages are a good explanation, or are observing reality, or maybe it's not a good hypothesis? And I don't know, it's a mixed feeling. I'm a little bit bothered with this kind of strategy. I want to hear from you. What do you think about it?
Fabio, I agree with you completely, and I'm glad you brought up your specific example. On the general point, I think there is indeed a tension. And, you know, did I do this? Did I navigate this tension just right? I'm not sure, but I stick with what I said, that I think it's, yes, I do concede a lot, and I concede a lot that I would not, in framing the models in terms of perfect competition, I'm conceding a lot that I do not obviously believe is true, but I do that with a specific goal in mind, and that, as you say, is attacking them in their citadel. And, you know, I'll go as far as I can with that. On the specific point of the inverse relationship between the real wage and output, it doesn't hold in my model. It holds for certain adjustment processes, but not for others. And the ones I think most plausible, and that's a judgment, it doesn't hold anymore. You know, that's why I like that particular example, because I think that the reason it holds is because in the traditional literature is because of the use of a comparative statics framework, which I argued great length is unacceptable. But as soon as you drop that and you look at specific adjustment processes, one of the things that emerges is that that particular result is contingent on particular adjustment processes. And if those don't happen to be the ones that hold in the real world, even in this competitive framework, then you don't get that inverse relationship. You're muted.
And I wonder if there is more questions. Professor Giuliano.
I will enjoy the professor. Professor, what do you think the capital controls? Is it covered in this book?
Capital controversy.
Capital controls.
Yeah.
Capital controls, open economy.
Controls.
Yeah, capital controls on capital flows.
Oh,
Capital
I'm
flows.
sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I misunderstood.
Yeah, capital flows.
No, it's a failing of the book. But given that 900 pages and 11 years, I thought that I could exclude certain things, not to say they're unimportant, but that I think the basic argument that I'm trying to make can be made in this simplified context of basically a closed economy. And I don't think the opening up of the economy, not that it's unimportant, but I don't think it changes any of the basic conclusions that I'm trying to argue for in this book. So thank you. That's a very important point to raise. And probably I should have said more about that in the book, but 900 pages.
It's too much.
The second round.
We can say that it's a book about the world economy, a closed world economy.
Well, that's, in a sense, that's right, because yes, and I say that at one point actually, because yeah, you're absolutely right. I do say it, but I say it in kind of, I think, in a footnote or something, and it's not, I don't go into it sufficiently probably for Giuliano and many other readers. And I think they're right in a sense, but I claim that the privilege of after 10 years, I can
stop at some point.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor.
My wife said at various occasions that this book was never going to be done, and that I'd be working on this, and that I really liked it so much that I'd be working on it the rest of my life. And I'm sure that a day would come when it was done, but a long time she didn't believe me.
Okay, so I think now we may finish the session, and I would like to thank Professor Stephen Marglin for his excellent presentation, and I hope that in the future we'll have you here in Brazil not online, but in Brazil in order to have a second round of discussions about this book. And Fabio, please.
Well, thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you very much, Fabio. Thank you very much, Joaquin. It was a great session, and I hope you all have enjoyed. And I hope that you have enjoyed too, Professor Stephen, to be here with us once again. You were with us online, okay, but with us this Tuesday and now this Thursday again. Thank you very much. You are very kind with us. Thank you very much.
No, it's been my pleasure, and I do look forward to joining you in person at some point. In the meantime, I invite you to engage with me and engage with the questions and arguments that I've made in Raising Keynes. I'm easily accessible by email. I don't respond immediately to everything because, especially in the summer we were talking earlier, I have other preoccupations like 7 grandchildren, but I do look forward to engaging with you, and I look forward even more to being with you in person at some point. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Joaquin, as well.
Thank you, Joaquin.
Thank you, Fabio and Fabio.